Pozdravljene in pozdravljeni. V tokratni epizodi podcasta sva se odločili, da predstaviva astronomijo v drugačni preobleki.
Za tiste, ki ste tu prvič, naj poveva, da v podkastu Temna stran Lune obravnavava znane in manj znane plati astronomije.
Pred časom sva na primer gostili profesorja Ivana Šprajca, ki raziskuje stične točke med astronomijo in arheologijo. V preteklosti je v eni od epizod nastopila tudi sodelavka, turška astronomka profesorica Ayşegül Tekel-Yekelci, ki je opisala nekaj turških astronomskih mitov.
Tokrat pa sva skupaj s profesorico Jarito Holbrook raziskovali, kaj na nočnem nebu vidijo v drugih kulturah, še posebej v Afriki. Jarita je čudovita sogovornica in raziskovalka, ki nama je predstavila, kako so staroselci in stare kulture uporabljale nebo za koledar in navigacijo, kakšne so bile njihove zgodbe, povezane z znanjami v Zvezdi in asterizmi, in pa koliko tega znanja se je ohranilo do danes. Prisluhnimo intervjuju. Professor Jarito Holbrook is an astrophysicist, and they're doing research at the University of Edinburgh and also Center for Astrophysics at Harvard and Smithsonian. They're an expert in star formation, and as well as cultural astronomy and astronomical heritage, ethnographic studies of indigenous astronomy with a focus on African indigenous astronomy. They're also a president of the International Society for Archaeoastronomy and Astronomy and Culture, and today we invited them to present us African cultural astronomy. Jarita, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Constellations and star stories are likely as ancient as humanity itself. As Elizabeth Marshall Thomas beautifully put it in her book, The Old Way, to live the old way is to live with the sky. Indigenous peoples with keen observation notice the cyclical rhythms of the heavens and tie them to their seasonal rhythms on Earth. They wove patterns in the sky into constellations, which became more than mere groups of stars. They were living stories rich with moral and social wisdom. These celestial narratives, passed down through generations by word of mouth, guided communities in their harmonious relationship with nature. In this way, these ancient constellations and their stories have become a treasured cultural heritage, echoing through time as a reminder of our deep connection to nature. So we know that most of this very ancient knowledge was passed down by the word of mouth over thousands of years until the colonization happened. So I wonder how much of this knowledge survived until today. And I also wonder how much of it has been researched or recorded by the Western science.
Okay, so the first answer is we don't know, right? We have no idea how much traditional knowledge has survived down to the present. You mentioned colonization, but modernization and the loss of dark skies are another thing that's threatening indigenous sky knowledge. Also, migration, right? A lot of people are now moving out of dark sky areas and into urban environments, which have a lot more light pollution. So we don't know. And then the second part of that question was how much has been recorded. And that is complicated. I want to say a lot, but my expertise is Africa, which has 54 countries. And some of the sky knowledge was recorded for all the wrong reasons. So they were priests who wanted to convert the local people. So they recorded a lot of sky knowledge in order to translate the Bible and convert them. Others were colonial administrators, and the bulk of their job was to get rid of indigenous knowledge. But then as it was disappearing, they were like, oh, well, maybe we should record some across Africa. And others are still living and viable. So it depends also on the type of indigenous knowledge and the many ways that it's entwined with culture. So the things that I find a lot of indigenous astronomy fascinating. But for example, today I'm sitting in Edinburgh, and there was the Center for African Studies annual meeting yesterday and today. And so today I was sitting in the Indigenous Knowledge section, and they were talking about Indigenous knowledge and sustainability and responses to climate change. And there was a young man who's getting his doctorate, and he's studying 3 communities that are in Kenya, in the Horn of Africa. And he was talking about how they were using indigenous knowledge to predict drought and rain, etc. And he had some parts about looking at the sky, right? So they look at, something this in this constellation, the plow, and that constellation. And then, but he went on to talk about, we're looking at the plants, we're looking at that. And of course, at the Q&A, I'm like, bam! So about this stuff that they're looking at the sky, are they doing this, this, and this? And he's like, yes. But the knowledge that I gathered, he's been doing field work, right? The knowledge that I gathered, I can spend all day talking about just the parts where they're looking at the sky. That's how much information I've gathered. And so then afterwards, I'm like, you should consider publishing that. So that's field work he's done in the last year. And it's with cattle herders in East Africa. So it's still around. And my famous study was on navigation by the stars. And I did that research over 5 years from 1997 to about 2003. And those were people in Africa and the United States and in Fiji who were still using the stars for navigation. So I had to learn what stars they were using, how they were using it, why they were using it, which I've published quite a lot about. So you find that when you think everything is gone, it's like, you're going to, people, when I said, I'm going to do research on African indigenous astronomy, they're like, there's nothing left, I don't know. And then you get on the ground and people know stuff and they're still using it. It's convenient. It's useful. It works.
Oh, yeah, that's fantastic to hear, because probably if you don't go out, for example, for us, of course, how do we know? We just assume that there's nothing left. But as you see, if you go out there, you see that no, there's a lot of knowledge still existing, which is very good news.
So speaking of this, since you mentioned your research and that there is a lot of research that can be done, so and my question is, what exactly is cultural astronomy, and how do you go about discovering and connecting with the guardians of traditional knowledge who hold these stories and insights? So how this field work is done?
So we'll start with definitions of cultural astronomy. There's 2 major definitions, and then there's my working definition.
Okay.
So one of the definitions was laid down in 1997 by Nick Campion, so Nicholas Campion, who's down at University of Wales, Trinity St. David. And his is, I have it in front of me, so I'll just read it off. This is very academic, but that's okay, because my definition is very easy to remember. So his definition is cultural astronomy is the study of the use of astronomical knowledge, beliefs, or theories to inspire, inform, or influence social norms and ideologies, or any aspect of human behavior. Cultural astronomy also includes the modern disciplines of ethnoastronomy and archaeoastronomy. So the other definition is put forward by Clive Ruggles, who's down at Leicester University. And I don't have that one in front of me. I thought I had it in front of me, but I don't. And it's also very, very long-winded definition of what cultural astronomy is. But here's the main gist of what he says, what Clive says, that there's 3 driving questions in cultural astronomy: observation, perception, and use. So observation, what do people look at in the sky? Is there a celestial body that they look for repeatedly? Do they make predictions about the next appearance of a celestial body? Okay, number 2, perception. What meaning do people attach to that which is observed? What is the cultural significance of the observations? This overlaps with cultural ethno-classification systems. And then number 3 is use. How do people use the sky? Use of the sky can be entwined with religion, agricultural timings, environmental adaptation, socio-political structures, or survival, such as navigation by the stars. Okay, so those are coming out of Clive Ruggles. And then it's interesting that both of them are in the United Kingdom. So they're both of them have undergraduate degrees from Cambridge, believe it or not. They were in the same class at Cambridge, but one of them was studying astrophysics and the other one was studying history, right? But they're both Cambridge graduates, but they didn't go to the same graduate school. And I met them both. Early in their careers, like back in 2004. So I met Nick, and then I met Clive like the next year, 2005. And then both of them came to a conference that I organized in Ghana in 2006. So they were both in the room, and it was very interesting talking to both of them and sort of plotting the future of cultural astronomy, but through the lens of African cultural astronomy. And if you are able to get your hands on my volume, I have a book called African Cultural Astronomy. One of them, I think, I don't think Clive revised his work, but Nick has an article or 2 in my volume. All right, so now you've heard like the big official. So the way I describe doing cultural astronomy is you need to have 2 elements to have a cultural astronomy project: people and the sky. If you're just studying the sky, that's astronomy. If you're just studying people, that's anthropology or sociology. But when you put it together, it becomes cultural astronomy. So you're actually studying people and their relationship to the sky. So that's my functional definition of cultural astronomy.
Yeah, that's nice and gives the idea of what cultural astronomy is. And
So now you asked me, you asked me a long, complicated question. Right? So then I've been asked a lot of times. It's very compelling. Cultural astronomy is very compelling to young people. So there's people who are physics majors and there's people who are anthropologists. And then there's people who are like, oh, I want to do archaeoastronomy, cultural astronomy, ethnoastronomy. And I probably get something to the order of 5 or 10 students who are either going into their undergraduate or in their undergraduate saying, this is the type of research that I would like to do. And then maybe 1 or 2 a year that want to do postgraduate work. Like, where can I go? Where are the programs? And to the undergraduates, like if they want to do a senior thesis or something like, oh, I have funds to go to such and such a place and I want to do a cultural astronomy research, how do I go about doing that, right? I tell them to look around themselves first, right? So it's best if you know somebody from the culture that you're studying, right? So people circulate everywhere. So if I wanted to do a project in Ethiopia, there's 3 people here at the university who are from Ethiopia that I would go and talk to. And that's not even the students. There's Ethiopian students as well, right? So I always, start with my friends and their families and try to get an invitation to go to their village or their town, or it's where you know somebody and you're dropping yourself into a family structure. So there's a bit of protection.
Mm-hmm.
And safety if you know the family and like, oh, this is so and so's, oh, my cousin's friend from the US or from the UK. And so that's how I tell them to start, is to look around them, to see what connections they already have, and to try to use those connections to be able to go to a place and do research. So I've done research where I knew nobody, and I've done research where I was pushed. Like I was like, oh, I'm like this person who does cultural astronomy research, and they're like, we have people that we want you to talk to. So you go get on this boat and you go, and they just guide my research. And I'm like, okay, no, you have to be, if you're in the field, you tend to be more flexible than you have to do that. And for me, even as I get older, I'm becoming even more flexible about doing field work and interviewing people. And I always tell the story about, there was a Native American student who had promised that we would do an interview together. And I was supposed to meet him at a conference, a astronomy conference, like 2 or 3 months later. And I said, oh, good, we'll meet at the conference and I'll do the interview with you then. He died. He died before. And that sort of made me even more flexible, that when somebody says they want to be interviewed, I'm going to make an effort to interview them, because you never know what's going to happen. You never know what's going to happen. Yeah.
And on the same time, as you mentioned, the relationship. So you build basically the relationship, and then you trust people, and also the trust is built, and then you can also start and do the field work. I imagine that this is the sociological. I don't know if the sociological part, but it's the human part, right? Because
Yeah.
the
And hopefully they'll know people and they'll introduce you to people who they think will have knowledge. And then the people who have knowledge will introduce you to other people. That's called the snowball.
That's perfect.
Oh, the snowball. It's a real scientific term, snowball method.
Wow.
Yeah. And that works out. And then there was a case where I was studying navigation by the stars in Fiji in the South Pacific. And I had read about this particular family. And strangely enough, I ended up in a room with somebody from that family. And so I started interviewing, talking to him. And he's like, how do you know that? That's my family secret. And I was like, well, I hate to tell you, but this anthropologist wrote this down in a book. It's not a family secret anymore.
Wow.
So he was happy that I knew it, but he was like, wait, that's our secret. And so I'm very much into doing non-extractive research these days, instead of.
What do you mean with non-extractive research? What is that?
Right. So when you're working with people, it's the power differential has to be negotiated, right? So, for example, I have two very prestigious appointments, one at the University of Edinburgh and the other at Harvard Smithsonian, right? So I can go into a community and learn all of their cultural astronomy, go back to either one of those places and write articles and become even more famous than I am now, but not actually give you the names of any of the people who I interviewed, and don't share authorship, right? It's their knowledge, right? So that is extractive research, where it's all for the benefit of my career, right? That is extractive. So I want it to be non-extractive.
Okay.
So that means sharing authorship, or not even being first author, being the person who pulls all the information together and working with the local people to produce the outcome, a paper, a film, or whatever, but giving them credit for their own knowledge. And they appreciate me for, saying that this is important and bringing it to light. But it's important to share it's their knowledge, and let them keep ownership of it.
Yeah.
Even when I was, sort of baby Jarito Holbrook, starting as a cultural astronomer 20 years ago, I was very aware of not sharing secret knowledge. So I would do a series of interviews, and as the layers of things that they told me, I would stop them. And I said, this really sounds like secret knowledge. Like, you should not be telling this to me. And they would, oh, no, Jarita, it's fine. It's fine. We can tell this to you. You can publish it. It's fine. Right. So you have to have a very strong ethical core when you're gathering this type of information. And am I at, I'm sitting in a position of great privilege. And so I'm very happy to share co-authorship and make sure that, everyone gets credit. I always did, in the acknowledgments, acknowledge my translators, because I don't speak 6 languages, right? And so I work with, and even the languages that I can speak, which are not English, right? I'm a native speaker. I don't speak like a professor in those languages. I speak like a tourist, right? And so I need to have somebody who has a very sophisticated command of the language and the terms that are astronomical. And they can really make or break your project. Is there, and so they should be given credit, right? So I'm definitely all about non-extractive, giving credit, letting people have control of their own knowledge. They can say what can be published and what can't be published, right?
So it's almost a community effort, right? So you have a community of people working on that.
Yes.
So we have also some questions about the constellations, actually. So the official constellations that are recognized by the International Astronomical Union are rooted in the Greek traditions in the northern sky, and reflect actually a European perspectives also in the southern hemisphere. And many of them were shaped during the so-called age of exploration, and a period that was also marked by colonization and exploitation. And as a result, the Western world often overlooks the fact that every culture has developed its own constellation and stories, and that are deeply tied to the local environment and seasonal cycle and cultural heritage. Um, could you maybe share with us some of the most well-known constellation from African cultures, and why are they significant, if they are linked to calendars or traditions or stories that carry some other meaning?
Yes, I can share.
There are a lot. I believe that.
Yes, you've
It's
read some of my articles looking at various asterisms
yeah.
and, clusters and planets in African cultures. And um, generally, like, I think one of the first publications, like first articles about African cultural astronomy, is called like the Pleiades in Africa. And it goes back to, I think, maybe 120 years ago. Someone wrote about the different ways that Africans perceived and used the Pleiades.
Mhm.
And um, there's, it's interesting. Let me just jump in. I won't try
Yeah.
to preface it. I'll just jump in. So Africans migrate, and you have to know this. When you're looking at any history of a region, you have to have some understanding of who's been in a place for how long, where did they come from, and did they go somewhere else, right? So there was something called the Great Bantu Migration, where they started in Central Africa. They moved to the east and to the south, right? So and they took their language and their stars with them, right? But talking about the Pleiades, of course, they used the Pleiades as a signal for agriculture and rain, like the marker of the rain and dry season and when it was time to plant or time to harvest. And so the name, you can linguistically trace the name like up and down the east coast of Africa. It sounds very similar. It's like Semolina, Melina, Semi, it's some combination like that. So you can tell that it's linguistically related. And Swahili, it's in Swahili as well. And Swahili was the trade language of East Africa. And people don't remember that, for 1,000 years, there was the Indian Ocean monsoon trade that still happens to a certain extent, where the trade winds take you from Indonesia all the way up and around to down the coast of Africa, and then they reverse, right? So there's a way that you can go to India. You can pop over from Madagascar to India, and then you go the other way, right? So it one way, and then the winds change to the other way. For 1,000 years, there was all this trade that was going on between Asia and Africa. And so the language of trade when you got to Africa was Swahili. It was Arabic and African languages, kind of all mixed together. And so some of those terms, you can see it is in Swahili as well. But it was from the Bantu people, and then, the Swahili, and it's all related to cultivation, the Pleiades. But how can they all use, we're talking, if you look at a map of Africa, people don't realize how big Africa is, first of all, that there's 54 countries, and then there's the island nation, so it could be up to 57, however you count. It's both northern and southern hemisphere. It's both temperate and tropical, right? And most of the countries are in the northern hemisphere. This is what blows everybody's mind, right? Most of the countries are in the northern hemisphere versus the number, I think there's only 13 that are in the southern hemisphere. And so how can you have the Pleiades be the marker of rainy season and agriculture when you have such different climates, tropical, arid, temperate? And what they did was they adjusted it to the local conditions, right? So if I'm going to say that the Pleiades is the marker of the beginning of the raining seasons, in some people where they are, that means that when you see the Pleiades just before sunset, just after sunset, then that's the beginning of the raining seasons. In other places, it's when you see the Pleiades overhead, right? And then other places, they'll be like when the Pleiades are just before the sun rises, right? So they've adjusted the time that they do the observation in order to fit the local conditions, in order to keep the Pleiades connected to the rainy season. So isn't that beautiful?
Very fascinating. Yeah.
So in terms of other asterisms, Pleiades, the thing about the Pleiades is it's visible. It's near the celestial equator, so it's visible from both the northern and the southern hemisphere. And when I'm looking at things to explore, I look for things along the equator, bright things along the equator, because there's a likelihood that many, many cultures have some sort of legend or something around them. And of course, the planets. The planets are visible from both northern and southern hemisphere. But when you're talking about the point about the monsoon trade, right? It's just one of many points to show how Africa was not this place in isolation ever. It never was, right? The north is right next to Europe, right next to the Middle East, right? And there was all this trade, and the trade routes There was the salt on the east. I'm sorry, on the west side of Africa. There's the salt trade that brought salt up through the Sahara, up to North Africa and into Europe. There was a period of time when the most the best smelted iron came out of Africa. So iron smelters were the best in the world for hundreds of years. There was a demand for this African iron and smelting all over the world. So that circulated up and out again. And so these cultures were not in isolation. Everyone thinks that there's this island that's called Africa, right? It's like, no. There was always trade relations. There was always a circulation of people and goods. And so when we're talking about things like I'm going to tell you about Orion and about Venus, right? And Venus in the northern hemisphere cultures of Africa is associated with women, right? But again, we're not far from Europe, right? It's circulation of ideas, and also Orion. Orion is the hunter in Greek mythology, but it has association with hunting in a lot of cultures in Africa. Not necessarily the same legend of Orion the hunter, but in West Africa, the belt of Orion is some sort of game animal, a dog, and a hunter, right? So it's still associated with hunting, but not in the same way as Orion. So we don't know, like, is this independent, or is it, this is how it always was, and it's just all these ideas circulating, because they were in trade contact and people moved around, right? They were not living in isolation.
Yeah, so this also means that these stories are very, very old as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Some stories are very, very old. Yeah. And it takes linguists. I trust the research of linguists that they can, they can sort of branch terms back, hundreds of thousands of years. And that's probably the only way we know how old some of these terms are, is from linguistic analysis, which I can't do. I do many things. I do not linguistic analysis. Yeah.
You also mentioned, stories about Orion and Venus. Is there, do you know any more details, like the story, or is more
like the legends around them?
Too many, too many.
Let me think. So a pretty common story about the Pleiades is, this is like the most famous, and I've said it before, and I said it. It's about the hopeless hunter. I don't know if you've heard me talk about the hopeless hunter.
No,
No.
not
Okay.
really.
I've done another podcast for Griffith Observatory where I talk about the hopeless hunter, and it's a very cute story. And there's a lot of cultural significance to this story. And I think you also asked me a question about the Milky Way, which I haven't talked about. The Milky Way. Let's talk about
Yeah,
the Milky Way.
yeah,
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
that would be interesting.
So you can look up the Hopeless Hunter. It's a very cute story. Okay. So, but the Milky Way, the South African story of the Milky Way, is really quite famous, where it's female first menstruation. So as a female comes into puberty, this is among the San people in southern Africa who are nomadic. So the legend goes that there was a young woman who had her first menses, and as part of the first ceremony, she has to be in seclusion. And part of the reason that she's in seclusion is because with that first menses, she's like this magical being, which is somewhat dangerous. Like all her energy is wild energy and etc. But in seclusion, they feed her sort of like vegetarian, like roots and but not meat. And so there's this young woman who is in seclusion, eating things, hungry, mad, magical. And under these conditions, the men go out to go hunt for meat for the end of the ceremony so that everyone has a big feast and there's meat. And they don't come home. Don't come home for days. And it's clear that something's happened and they're possibly lost. And so the young woman, first of all, the way the legend goes depends on the San group how the legend goes. But this is just one of the many legends. She breaks the taboo by coming out of the seclusion hut because she's hungry and wants to know what's going on. And they said, well, the men haven't come back from hunting and it's been several days and we don't know what's going on. So she's pretty irritated, but she's quite magical. And they have a fire. And she grabs the fire and she throws it up into the sky. And that becomes the Milky Way. And that is the beacon for them, for the hunters to see that the way home is this way. And so then they come home and bring the meat and everything's really good. But other little nuances of the story is there's, that since they're feeding her these roots and stuff, it's different colors. And so when she throws it up in the sky, you'll see like red, which means root, and then, white, which means ashes, and the cloudy, the smoke, right? So all of that is accounted for in this legend, the different colors and the smoke in the Milky Way, the cloudiness of the Milky Way. And I think another question that you had was about the dark constellations.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Dark constellations are a southern hemisphere thing. For a while, they thought it was only the Aboriginal people of Australia, but other people have documented them in South America. And in South Africa, they have associated with some game, like, in South Africa, there's the springbok, there's the steenbok, there's some buck, right? Which is a deer-like animal. Quagga was the name that I heard when I was doing field work. The guy said, "Oh, that's a quagga." That the part of the Coal-Sack Nebula, the dark patch of the Milky Way. So, and I have to say that when I'm looking at other people's records of, like I said, colonial records or in archival things, that I'm always having to keep in mind that the person who is recording this may or may not be familiar with the sky, right? So there's always these debates, like if they say this and we go and look and it's not actually there, and it's like, okay, what mistake did this person make? But in some cases, they have consulted with astronomers, right? They said, you astronomer, I'm getting a lot of this sky knowledge. Can you come and help me identify these things? So it's not always lost, right? It's not like, oh my God, I have to unravel the crazy things that they're saying. And, they have the sun rising in the west and, it's not always a lot of times, but another thing that I know is that a lot of things were missed because they're not cultural astronomers. They don't necessarily know what questions to ask. There's the thing is, as a cultural astronomer, if you're ever going to teach cultural astronomy, you have to read very, very widely in cultural astronomy. So I designed a class on cultural astronomy of the Pacific. So I read a bunch of stuff about the Pacific Islands and their kinds of astronomy. And I did, cultural astronomy of North America. So all the stuff on the Native Americans in North America, and the Mexicans, and, and I traveled up and down to Central America with Anthony Avini. So I know a lot about the Maya and the people in Mexico City and their pyramids, and European cultural astronomy. So a lot of the things about passage tombs and Stonehenge and standing stone circles, and so you become very, very well read. So Asia, I'm a little bit weaker on Asia, but there's a whole book that's just on Asian cultural astronomy.
Oh, wow.
So I have to read that, right? But I Asia and Pacific when I was teaching cultural astronomy of the Pacific. It was cultural astronomy of Asia and Pacific. So I had a few Asian examples, and so you're very well read on the types of cultural astronomy and the types of things that people looked at all around the world. So you know what kind of questions to ask in any situations, like, oh, are you using this? Are you using that? Are you doing that? Do you acknowledge this? And as an astronomer, I think, are both of you guys astronomers?
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you both observational astronomers? Will you go to the telescope?
Me, yes.
Me not, but I am on other side. Also.
You do theory, more theory.
Yeah.
Okay, there's this part of being an observer that is not really acknowledged, but is a reality. And that is, we can predict the weather, right? We are there, right? We are continuously having to scan the horizon for clouds.
Oh, yes.
And at a particular observatory, we know the direction that bad weather is coming from. We say, oh, if we see a cloud coming up, we're in trouble. Shut the dome now.
Yeah.
You don't want the electronics to get wet. You don't want the mirror to get wet, right? You actually don't want a whole lot of humidity, so you don't want to be in fog. And so we become very skilled at looking at the sky and knowing the weather, right? And what direction. And we don't talk about, as astronomers, we don't talk about this, right? But we do learn this. In every observatory, we take the time to learn the weather patterns. And we know that during certain times of year, it will come from this direction. Another time, it will come from that direction, right? So that learning about the weather at observatories comes in handy when you're on the ground talking to people about sky lore, because then you have a whole conversation about weather patterns, right? So what are you looking for to predict rain? And this is what the student was talking about today, right? What are the things you're looking at? A halo around the moon, what does that mean? And when the stars are really scintillating, when they're really dancing, that's wind in the upper atmosphere. Does that mean a front is coming in or a front is going out, right? And so on. So our unacknowledged weather knowledge as astronomer is also useful when studying cultural astronomy.
Yeah, that's true. So what about the sun? For example, so now we spoke about the Milky Way, constellations, stars. But usually, the sun is very important because major regions are based on this. So what about in Africa?
Yes. So some of the African cultures, of course, have a lot of sun worship, right? It's just, it's the sun can kill you. In some parts of Africa, the sun can kill you. The sun can heal you. There's a lot of respect for the sun, and same for the moon, right? And the moon is usually associated with women. And I started to collect stories about when the moon was not associated with women. There's another, what do I want to say? There's another aspect of animals and the sky that I've been toying with. I've been thinking about it, but I haven't actually been on the ground and actually talked to people about it. And that is the fertility cycle of certain animals. So we know that in South Africa that there's the wildebeest star, and that when it's up, it's either the beginning or the end of breeding season, and with the little wildebeest. And of course, in Australia, the emu in the sky, when it's time to eat the eggs, it's orientated one direction, and when it's time to leave them alone, it's oriented in another direction. So there's a connection between animal behavior and sky behavior. But the moon and women's menstruation is a thing, right? And so I wonder if there's also more nuanced things like other animals that they're watching for their cycle. In the Pacific, the calendar was this is this is sounds very strange. It sounds very strange, but it's consistent in a certain region of the South Pacific. Their calendar was built around the bololo worm,
A
right?
worm.
What?
And the bololo, bololo worm, right?
Okay.
And what is the bololo worm? It's this sea creature that once a year, like it comes up to the surface, and it's very tasty.
Oh.
It's very, very tasty. So they gather it, and they cook it up, and it's a good meal. But it's once a year. It's a big thing, and if I remember correctly, I may be wrong about it. It's phosphorescent,
Oh. Mhm.
so it glows. It glows. And so this big annual thing sort of resets the calendar every
Wow.
year is the rise of the bololo worms, and you go out and you harvest it. And then after that, it's a lunar calendar. Um, so the lunar calendar with this bololo worm on top of it, and then with the larger weather patterns of rainy season and dry season, right? So calendars were not just this count,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
It was embedded in environmental clues and
Mhm.
signals.
Yeah.
So you're asking me about the sun. I got distracted
It's
again,
okay.
and I know we're starting to run out of time,
It's very
but
interesting. Don't worry.
Yeah.
There's in the Pacific, there's a set of stories that are called Snaring the Sun
Uh-huh.
stories. And the way that the story goes is, of course, it's once upon a time. And they're in some ways they're always calendar stories, right? About setting things the way they are now. And so once upon a time, the sun moved too fast. And so you have to have your culture hero lasso and capture the sun to slow it down so that there was actually more time to do things in a day. And across the Pacific, there's these, culture to culture, they have these snaring the sun and slowing down the sun stories, right, in order to have longer hours of daylight. So
Wow.
there you go.
Very
Sun.
interesting.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So many stories all around the world.
Yeah.
So many
Yeah.
stories. Yeah. And of course, as an instructor, as a cultural astronomer, but someone who teaches cultural astronomy, picking and choosing.
It's a hard
It's
job.
So
difficult.
many stories. Okay, what's the point I want them to carry
Yeah.
away today? And it's so interdisciplinary, right?
Mhm.
I had to
Yes.
learn to be an anthropologist in order to do my work. I had to learn to navigate, by the stars. I had to learn the sky in a very deep way, both northern hemisphere
The
and
sun.
southern hemisphere, because one of my sites is in the southern hemisphere. So I had to learn, by eye, what are these constellations, and
Mhm.
the ones that I was not familiar with growing
Mhm.
up. So it's great because it really stretched me as a person,
Mhm.
leaving astrophysics and going into cultural astronomy,
Mhm.
and just thinking about things another way. So I also had to learn a lot of folklore and mythology, and I have fantasies, for probably before I had my second child. I'm a mother. I have two daughters. Um, I had my first daughter when I was a postdoc. So when I was doing that
Mhm.
navigation project for 5 years, I had one kid during that time. And then before I had my second kid, I really wanted to do this project on dance
Mhm.
and the sky, like where cultures have some sort of celestial dance to either, bring things down or make sure that it's a harvest, or and I've found like 4 or 5 cultures around the world, and I'm sure there's more, where they have songs and a dance that's a celestially related dance. And I wanted to just do a project on that. And I could never get the money to do that. So one day, maybe.
Fingers crossed.
Future project.
I always imagined that I would have an army of graduate students to go and do all these things. But the majority of the graduate students who've approached me just want to study gender issues in astronomy, right? So they want to study astrophysicist and gender, like the way that they're making women miserable, right? As astrophysicists. We're all women here. So we all know that there's a grain of truth in that.
That's true.
But only two of my students were interested in actually doing field work and collecting more like cultural astronomy with indigenous people. Only two.
Yeah. Maybe in the future there are more.
Maybe.
Yes. So you also mentioned gender, and you also did lots of research about the sky that's gendered. So we know, for example, for the Slovenians, we know Greek culture in the sky. Most of the heroes are men in the sky. There's only a few women, and most of them were there because they tried to escape some bad things, violence in the earth. So I wonder, does this gender imbalance, does it exist also in African cultural astronomy, for example? Are most of the hero constellations men, or are there also women? Is there more balance?
So the answer is, again, I don't know. Because if you're going to do a study like that, you have to know every constellation in that culture. And you have to do sort of statistics to see if, okay, we have 88 constellation and how many are men, how many are animal, how many are women, right? So we could do that with our 88 constellations, but we tend to not know all the constellation and asterisms of a particular culture in order to do that kind of analysis. So when I present on women in the sky and gendered, female animals and things like that, I am reporting on what is known, not the entire knowledge, right? I'm reporting on this part of a huge sky, right? So I can't do a statistical analysis because we don't know their whole sky.
Yeah. And the last question is about some of your other projects. So you're leading several contemporary African astronomy projects, and one of them is Oral History Project for South Africa, and the other one is Astro Moves. And also, you're a very prolific movie maker. And one of your, I believe it's not the latest. There are even.
It was from 2017, but it was just released on YouTube. And that's Black Suns and Astrophysics Adventure. Did you get to watch any of that?
Yes, well, I didn't have time to watch it whole, but I could see some of it.
I said just watch the beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning, yes.
So yeah, could you tell us about this project?
About some of these other projects? And so of course, being they can't see me, it's a podcast, you can't see me, and from my voice you really can't tell either. I sound like an American, but I'm actually African American, right? So I'm descended from both Native Americans and African slaves and Europeans. So those are like the three cultures that are embedded in me. And so I'm very concerned with the presence of non-Europeans in astrophysics. And most of the people are diversifying astrophysics, and they consider increasing the number of women to be diversifying, but not any other type of diversity. So Astromoves had a gendered lens. I worked very hard to find people who were non-heterosexual to interview, to talk about their experiences in astrophysics and how they navigated their careers, and if the fact that they were non-heterosexual impacted how they navigated their careers. Interestingly, or maybe not so interestingly, the project was hijacked by COVID. And so almost all the art, I've maybe written 6 articles off of that project, and half of them are just on COVID, right? Because, COVID was cutting edge. People didn't have a lot of data. I had data. Everybody, wanted to talk about their experiences. I was doing the project during COVID. And so I have a very deep understanding of the struggles that astrophysicists had, again, using a gendered lens during COVID, right? And how they struggled with mental health and loneliness as part of mental health, time management. Um, I won't say depression, but that the situation was so dire that they lost interest in doing astrophysics. So it's kind of like depression, but they never used the term depression. So and I got them to say these things on film. So I have films where they say this. Just it was how could I spend my time doing astrophysics when the world was in trouble, right? And I didn't have the skills to help anybody. It felt like it was indulgent, and so it's very poignant. Some of the things that people say in these films, and they're freely available because most of my films are funded by grants, right? And so as part of grants, I eventually have to release them for public consumption. But I want it to, but because it's grant funded, you want to know how many people have seen the films. So you keep a tight hold for a few years just so you can sort of have numbers to report back to the granting agency. But by far, my films get way more views than any of my articles, right? It's like, because it reaches down. I've had kids as young as kindergarten. I've shown my films in kindergarten classes, and all the way up, to elderly people. And so it's just so much more accessible than an academic article about cultural astronomy. And yeah, so I always try to include part of my budget for making films when I write for a research grant. So Astro Moves, like I said, it was a gendered lens. It was about how astrophysicists migrate, and the decisions that they make. And the idea being, so because we come from a very quantitative background, uh, when you're designing a project that's a social science project and you try to explain it to astrophysicists, they just kind of miss it. They kind of miss the point sometimes. So, like, they want to know, they want a representative sample, right? So I'm talking about, okay, I interviewed these people, and this is not a representative sample. And they're like, but shouldn't it be I'm like, okay. So if I did a study that was a representative sample of astrophysicists, it would all be European men, period. I would learn nothing, right? Because they're dominating everything, right? So in order to change astrophysics, we have to look at people who are not, heterosexual men of European descent, because they have different needs and they have different issues that are not being addressed. And until you talk to them, you're not going to know what those are, right? So, so I'm forever studying non-representative samples. And you're like, well, how do you get it past referee? You tell them I'm doing a non-representative sample, and these are the reasons why, right? I will not learn much from always studying the majority of the population in astrophysics when they want things to change. So I'm helping them change by interviewing the people that are making that by their embodied changes. And that's not just diversity in terms of women and ethnic and racial diversity. It's Eastern European versus Western European. It's visible disabilities, invisible disabilities, neurodiversity, and sexuality. Like people have different sexual preferences as well, which is different from sex. Like there's male, female, transgender, and then sexuality becomes, non-binary, homosexual, heterosexual. And what I found in my studies is that astronomers conflate the two. Like they don't really know the difference between sexuality, gender, and sex, right? So they just put it all together as. And so when I give lectures to people who are social scientists, they're like, but you're conflating all these. I'm like, that's because my population conflates them. They put it all together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yes. Yes, definitely. So,
And the films, I didn't even get to. So
Yeah.
So that project Asher Moves has a lot of films coming out of it, and I'm still editing films, and I'm still writing articles from that because, I wrote how many articles on COVID because that was the hot topic, but I was supposed to talk about migration, right? Astrophysics migration, and I only have a preliminary article on that, but I need to have like the real article about how they're moving, right? And I can tell you that an interesting finding is that in the move from graduate school to the first postdoc for most of my population, when I added up the distance, that the first postdoc was further away than the second one, right? And so that's really, really interesting because it's, I averaged everybody together and I'm like, okay, so it's like more adventures. And one of the things that I hypothesized after, studying people for a while is that the first postdoc, whatever their decisions were, the second postdoc, they had a family at that point, or they had a partner at that point. And so it became a more complicated decision. And if they had children, right, it became a family decision and not just a decision for their career. And in that case, some of the times they wanted to be in the support system to help them, right? They wanted to have their parents babysitting cousin, or if they had partnered in the city of their first postdoc, then their partner was from that city, and there would be a resistance to leaving because that's their support system, right? So yeah, it needs to be all written up, and hopefully in the next year I'll write it up and get that article just about the migration aspect of the Astromoves program, out the door. So the other films, I started making films in 2006, or facilitating films in 2006. So most of my films have to do with diversity and astrophysics, right? So there's the Ghana Eclipse Conference, where we were in Ghana for the total solar eclipse. So you see all these Ghanaians and you see solar eclipses. And then there's Hubble's Diverse Universe, which was attributed to the Hubble Space Telescope, but we only talked to African American and Hispanic Americans about their experiences with the Hubble Space Telescope, right? And then the next film was Black Suns, which you saw, which we filmed most of in 2012, but it wasn't released until 2017. So that was it took a long time to get enough funds to actually do all the editing and get it out the door. And then around the same time that Black Suns was released, I was completing a project while I was living in South Africa on the Square Kilometer Array. So I have 3 films on the Square Kilometer Array that came out almost at the same time as Black Suns. And then lately is the Astromoves. Right. And I have a couple of YouTube channels, and I play with various forms. So I have a series called Inside a Scientist's Suitcase and Roll Like a Scientist. And then we have a family travel show called The Science Tourists. So that's me, my husband, and our 2 daughters are around the world. We each have a different scientific interest, and you see it come out. That's like 15 to half an hour for those shows, and I think we have 7 episodes. And the funny thing is, of course, I'm very creative. I can always think of stuff to do, but then my job gets in the way.
Yeah.
So most of the things happen when I'm nominally unemployed, right? I do a lot of filmmaking and stuff when I'm unemployed, and then I get employed, and then it's like it stops. Right? And so you only see me doing my research-related filmmaking when I'm employed or have a grant. And then when I'm not being paid, then I play more with my other series. So I probably have a lot of footage for doing more role like a scientist, because I went to Sweden, and I went to Japan again. I mean, and I just haven't had time to sit down and edit those. And people are like, "Oh, you're going to do another episode?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'll get to it." But I always am filming, right? I have the most expensive camera I own is my iPhone, right? Which does 4K filmmaking. I have several to my left here. I have 3 digital cameras, but none of them do 4K. They were all bought. Probably the latest one we bought was in 2017, but even that one was not a 4K. That's a 1080 resolution of 1080. So if I want 4K high resolution, it has to be on, an iPhone, and you turn it sideways, right? You don't make it vertical, you have to turn it sideways. But I also mentioned earlier that in 2018, I went to night school in order to become a better filmmaker. So I actually have a filmmaking certificate that I earned in 2018.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating and beautiful. And we'll put links to your movies in our show notes. And yeah, we are looking forward to see more movies from you.
Soon.
Yeah, so Jarita, thank you. Today we spoke about lots of different things, from cultural astronomy all around the world and in Africa, to diversity, to filmmaking. So it's been very, very interesting. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to hearing this, and I hope that the audience enjoys the films. Yeah, and the podcast. Enjoys the podcast, and then enjoys the film.
Kaj bo zanimivega na majskem nočnem nebu? Temperature so se v preteklem mesecu dvignile in zadnji aprilski teden smo imeli kar nekaj primernih dni za opazovanje nočnega neba. Kot sva zadnjič povedali, se bo na začetku maja, točneje med 3. in 6. majem, Mars pomikal čez območje, ki ga na nebu zaseda razsuta kopica jasli. Razsuta kopica je skupina mladih zvezd, ki so se rodile hkrati, vendar se bodo v nekaj 100 milijonih let porazgubile. Razsuto kopico jasli najdemo v ozvezdju Raka. Ta kopica, torej te kopice jasli iz urbanega okolja ne bomo videli s prostim očesom. Potrebovali bi temno nebo in pa opazovanje v takem obdobju, ko smo v bližini luninega mlaja. Jasli so pa izredno lepa kopica, ki si jo lahko s prijatelji ogledate recimo s pomočjo binokularja. To sem tudi sama storila ob obisku prijateljev, ki so se zadržali še do poznih ur pri nas doma v urbanem okolju in so prvič opazovali torej Mars in zvezdno kopico in bili nad samim pogledom tudi zelo navdušeni. Kot rečeno, torej predlog za tokratni mesec je večerno opazovanje Marsa, kopice jasli in Lune. Sicer bodo v teh dneh nam bo malce zagodlo vreme, ampak vseeno upajmo, da bo kmalu dovolj dobro vreme, da bomo lahko opazovali. Za vse, ki pa se zbujate dovolj zgodaj, predlagava opazovanje Venere in Saturna na vzhodnem delu neba. Konec meseca boste v bližini teh 2 planetov opazili tudi Lunin srp. Oboje bo vidno uro pred sončevim vzhodom. Za tiste najbolj navdušene pa predlagava opazovanje izredno tankega luninega srpa. Opazujete ga lahko nad severovzhodnim nebom 26. maja zjutraj. Nato pa 17 ur kasneje, na večernem nebu v torek 27. maja po sončevem zahodu. Mlaj, torej prazna luna, bo namreč nastopil med tema dvema dogodkoma. Torej boste tanek lunin srp opazovali, ko se luna cedi, nato pa, ko se začne debeliti.
V zapiskih epizode najdete povezavo do knjige Glej jih zvezde, v kateri so opisani prizori, ki jih lahko s prostimi očmi ali pa z enostavno opremo opazujete čez vse leto. Ravno tako so med povezave dodali aplikacije, ki vam služijo za razpoznavanje ozvezdij in svetlejših teles na nebu. Prav tako pa najdete tudi spletne povezave za spremljanje preletov mednarodne vesoljske postaje in vesoljskega vremena ter sončeve aktivnosti. Predloge, pohvale in kritike sprejemava na podcast.tm@gmail.com ali pa na družbenih omrežjih, kjer naj najdete z uporabniškim imenom Temna stran lune.
Hvala vsem, ki s svojimi prispevki podpirate podcast. Najino delo lahko podprete s simbolično kavo na spletni strani ko-fi.com/temna stran lune in jo najdete v zapiskih epizode.
Podcast je del mreže aktivnosti Zavoda Kozmolab, ki se ukvarja s promocijo in popularizacijo astrofizike. Na spletni strani cosmolab.si najdete povezavo do portalov Vesolje in portalovega podcasta, kjer kozmolabovec Jure Japelj objavlja zanimive novice o vesolju in astronomiji.
Za glasbeno kuliso podcasta Temna stran lune se zahvaljujeva Peliju iz sosednjega podcasta. Opravičujemo se za vse nevšečnosti, ki je podcast o življenju, vesolju in sploh vsem in ga soustvarjajo Peli, Aljo in Zi.
Če vam je bila epizoda všeč, se nama pridružite v naslednji epizodi letošnje sezone, prvi ponedeljek junija. Z vami sva bili
Dunja,
in Maruša. Se slišimo!
adijo!